In the summer of 1903, an aging archaeologist stood at the edge of an excavation trench and stared down at something that should not have been there. Not a pottery fragment, not an ancient burial, but what witnesses described as a human skeleton measuring nearly 12 feet in length. According to several local accounts, the discovery drew laborers, townspeople, and even passing travelers to the site. Some claimed they saw enormous leg bones. Others described a skull so large that a child could reportedly sit inside it. And then, almost as suddenly as the discovery appeared, it vanished. The excavation was halted. Records became difficult to find. Photographs were never publicly displayed. And the archaeologist responsible for the dig spent the final years of his life refusing to discuss what happened. Why? What was uncovered in that remote field in 1903? And why did so many people later insist that the bones had been buried again? To understand the mystery, we must travel back to a very different America. The early 20th century was an age of discovery. Archaeologists were uncovering forgotten civilizations. Newspapers eagerly reported unusual finds. Museums competed for rare artifacts. In many parts of the country, excavation crews worked on farmland, construction sites, and remote hillsides where ancient remains were occasionally found. One such location lay beyond the limits of a small rural town whose population barely exceeded a few thousand people. The area was quiet. Dirt roads connected scattered farms. Telegraph lines stretched across open fields. Most local news traveled faster through conversation than through print. It was here that Professor Edwin Mercer arrived during the spring of 1903. Mercer was not known for sensational claims. Colleagues described him as cautious, methodical, and often skeptical of extraordinary reports. That is what makes the events that followed so difficult to ignore. Because according to surviving accounts, Mercer himself requested additional workers after the excavation began. Something beneath the soil had captured his attention. And whatever it was larger than anyone expected. The earliest reference to the discovery appears in a small newspaper clipping preserved decades later by local historian Clara Whitmore. The article was brief. It mentioned an archaeological excavation outside town and referenced unusually large skeletal remains. No measurements were given. No photographs appeared. But that was not the strangest part. A second article, published only days later, reported that access to the site had been restricted. Visitors were being turned away. The excavation continued behind temporary fencing. And then the story simply stopped. No follow-up. No museum announcement. No scientific report. Nothing. If the remains were ordinary, why the sudden secrecy? If they were a mistake, why not publicly correct the record? The official trail should have ended there. But it didn't. One of the few names repeatedly connected to the excavation was Samuel Hargrove. Hargrove worked as a surveyor and was responsible for mapping sections of the site. Years later, according to a family letter, he reportedly described the excavation as the strangest work of my life. The letter offered no detailed explanation, only a curious warning. It stated that some findings were better left where they are. Before we go further, remember that phrase, because it appears again later. Another important figure was Clara Whitmore. Unlike most residents, Whitmore kept old documents rather than throwing them away. Over decades, she collected newspaper clippings, personal correspondence, and local records. Much of what survives about this mystery comes from her efforts. Without her, the entire story might have disappeared. Then there was Judge Walter Pierce. At first glance, his presence makes little sense. Judges rarely involve themselves in archaeological excavations. Yet county records suggest Pierce visited the site shortly before work was suspended. Why would a regional official take interest in a scientific dig? That question becomes increasingly important. The strongest clues come not from dramatic stories, but from scattered documents. First came the newspaper reports, then a survey map. In the margin of that map was a small handwritten note. Most readers overlooked it. Yet one sentence changed everything. It referred to a primary specimen and instructed workers to alter excavation boundaries. Primary specimen. Singular. Not specimens. not remains. 1. A single object important enough to change the entire layout of the dig. What exactly was it? The record never says. Then another clue surfaced. A private letter allegedly written by Mercer to a colleague. The letter described an unexpected anatomical arrangement. Those words are frustratingly vague, but they suggest Mercer believed he had found something unusual. Whether the report was accurate or exaggerated, one detail remains difficult to explain. Mercer never published a formal paper about the discovery. For a researcher approaching the end of his career, that silence is remarkable. Scientists typically publish their most important findings. Mercer did the opposite. He withdrew from public discussion entirely. And this is where the story becomes difficult to dismiss. For decades, many assumed the bones had been dismissed as a hoax. But a forgotten archive introduced a troubling possibility. According to local administrative records, transportation funds were briefly allocated to move materials from the excavation site. Not artifacts, materials. The wording is vague, yet the timing matches the period immediately after the reported discovery. What happened next made no sense. The transportation record exists. The destination record does not. The trail simply ends. No receiving institution. No museum inventory. No storage ledger. Nothing. Then researchers noticed something even stranger. Several witnesses described the remains before publication of the supposed measurements. Yet their descriptions were surprisingly consistent. Each referenced extraordinary size. Each mentioned a partially exposed skeleton. And each account was recorded independently. The report was not buried because everyone thought it was false. If anything, the records suggest too many people claim to have seen the same thing. Keep that detail in mind, because it changes how we view everything that follows.